And we are back on Erectile Dysfunction Radio. Today, I want to have us kind of have a little more of a relaxed discussion and maybe kind of go through an anecdote, a story that I encountered listening to a comedy podcast. And if you'll excuse us on the video today, we have headphones on for the first time. So if you see us making some adjustments, please don't pay any attention to that. So I want to join Mark and ask him about erectile dysfunction when it happens because you're too excited for a sexual encounter. Erectile dysfunction and being too excited for a sexual encounter. It almost sounds counterintuitive, but I was listening to a podcast the other day where a comedian who was having a very candid moment, and you'll hear a lot of that in podcasts, and he was discussing a sexual encounter that he had in his 20s or 30s. So he was young, and it was a hookup type sexual encounter, and he was so excited for this sexual encounter, this what he thought might be a one-time only thing, that he couldn't get erect. Erectile dysfunction hit him at quite possibly the worst time it possibly could, as he explained it. So sex therapist Mark Goldberg joining us today on the Erectile Dysfunction Radio Podcast, as he does every week. And I want to get his feedback on this story. Mark, what are your initial thoughts on that?
So I think that that is a very rare presentation. So let me take a few steps back for a moment and make a distinction between what people think is causing erection problems and what actually may be causing them. So many people, when they first encounter erectile dysfunction or they have an experience where they don't quite get the erection that they want, they look for an answer. They look for a reason. I have no doubt that this comedian was very excited, in part, about his encounter, but I'm not sure if he is reporting the full story and if this was part of him sharing a bit or making something comical.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of embellishing stories when you're talking about comedians, but I do think he was being sincere, and this really did happen, and I've heard of it happening to people before.
Yeah, and again, there's no doubt that people can have mixed experiences where they're both excited and nervous. And I would initially be curious about that. I would want to be inquisitive as to whether excitation was the only thing being felt in those moments or if there was something else going on. Generally speaking, Casey, like you pointed out, it sounds almost counterintuitive. And I think the first thing I'd be curious about is it counterintuitive? Mm-hmm. So I want to know what else was going on. You mentioned that it was a hookup. So I don't know what his experiences have been with or were with hookups. Hookups for some people are pure excitation. For other people, though, it carries a lot of nerves, a lot of anxiety, a lot of self-doubt. And I would be curious about those elements and if they may have been present as well.
Yeah, that is always the X factor in that. Generally speaking, though, how could this possibly happen? It feels like at that moment, you should be able to get aroused instantly if this is someone you're extremely excited to be in a sexual encounter with, right?
So one would think that. And again, I want to emphasize my starting point with a client like this who came to see me after a situation like this would be looking for factors outside of excitation. All that being said, if you're asking, is it possible that being at high levels of excitation could cause erectile dysfunction, I think it is possible.
Is there any way to prevent this from happening to him in the future?
So the question is there any way to prevent the erectile dysfunction resulting from high levels of excitation?
Exactly, yeah.
Interesting question. So again, assuming that his erectile dysfunction is stemming from being very excited, there would be a number of ways to try to approach this. Obviously, I cannot guarantee that we'd be able to prevent erectile dysfunction if it was coming from excitation. But one of the areas we want to look at is, what is his excitation profile? What is getting him so excited? Is there any way to modulate that down? And when I say modulate that down, I don't mean to eliminate the excitation that he's experiencing in totality, but is there something in particular that has this gentleman at a very high level of excitation? So we may, in the sex therapy world, we may not be able to help him redo his underlying wiring that has the excitation being translated as anxiety or creating this kind of response in the body. But what we might be able to help with is the experiences that have been causing this level of excitation. We could help those to be processed differently and hopefully not trigger this type of response. That probably would be the treatment path that I would be taking if it really were pure excitation that is causing the erectile dysfunction.
Do you see a lot of differences with erectile dysfunction happening when it's a casual hookup versus a more established relationship type sexual encounter?
It'd be hard to answer that on a statistical basis.
Okay.
What I can say is that there definitely is a different experience between erectile dysfunction in, we'll call it the hookup culture, and erectile dysfunction in long-term relationships. So again, for some people, hookups bring pure excitation, and they really don't experience erectile dysfunction, barring this rare gentleman that we're talking about. And for other people, it's very anxiety-provoking. So it can be very different, but I think a lot of that has to do more with the individual and less to do with the situation. So if a person finds long-term relationships to be lacking excitation, they may experience erectile dysfunction, where going out into a hookup culture would be very exciting. And there are other people that really appreciate the safety and security of a longer-term relationship and find hookup culture to be anxiety-provoking. So I think it can split either way.
Yeah, and we should just note that when you're talking about hookup culture or a hookup instance, it's also known as one-night stand, anything kind of like that. When you're kind of maybe out on the town, spring break, that type of thing. So I think it's clear from this conversation, just to make sure I understand you from the listener's perspective, that when you're in that sexual encounter, it's different expectations going on than when you're with someone that you've already established a relationship with. And what is the psychology behind that? Is this something that is noted in your world of therapy, and it almost makes it more exciting to not know the person or that type of thing?
So this is a great question, and there's a lot of literature out there that grapples with this issue. So I think the way I think about this is we're really, really complex as human beings. Our brains are very complex. Our needs are very complex. Many of us have a need for safe connection, for security, reliability, and predictability. We also have a need for excitation, which comes from unpredictability. And trying to figure out how to manage these sets of needs, I think, can be understood along this line of secure long-term relationships versus seeking out one-night stands and hookups.
Awesome. That makes a lot of sense. Brings a little more clarity to the situation. I'm not going to name drop the comedian, but hopefully he's listening out there. So any final thoughts for us on today's episode?
Yeah, so that idea that we're talking about toward the end of this episode, I think really plugs back in to my initial skepticism that this person is experiencing pure excitation, because in that hookup encounter, I would really want to know about his relationship profile. Does he feel specifically comfortable with the hookups? Is there anything about that is uncomfortable? The mind is very complex, and even things that seem like they are pure excitation are oftentimes not quite what meets the eye.